Okay, so you guys just looked at the handout on radians, and it kind of guided you through what a radian is and how to find a few of those radians on the unit circle. What we're going to do now is figure out all of these different angles and what they would look like in radians. So the first thing they talked to you about in the handout is 2 pi r. So if you think about 2 pi r, that is the circumference of the entire circle. Okay, so remember that our radius on the unit circle is 1. So if you were to put a 1 over here, you would just get 2 pi. So that means that one full rotation around in radians would be 2 pi. I'm going to do all my radians in this other color. So if this whole thing is 2 pi, half of that, which would be 180, would just be pi. Now, if we keep going, half of that, which was 90, would be pi over 2. And so if we have pi over 2, we have pi. Let's think about what 270 would be. Another way you could think about this right here is 1 pi over 2. So if we have another 90 degrees, that means we have 2 pi over 2's, which is equivalent to pi. If we have another 90 degrees, that means that this would be 3 pi over 2. And then a full rotation, which is another 90 degrees, would be 4 pi over 2, which is just 2 pi. So that's how the original points are being converted to radians. We're going to go ahead and do the rest of the angles. So we're going to start with, we'll actually start with 45. So what we're going to go off of is the fact that 180 is pi. So when we're thinking about 45 degrees, what we want to do is think about how many 45-degree angles are in 180. And if you guys look, we have 45. If you add to 45, you get 90. If you add 45, you get 135. One more 45 would give you 180. So that means that there are four 45-degree angles that are in 180. So that means 45 degrees is the same thing if you were to divide 180 by 4. So if you do 180 divided by 4, you get 45. So that means that the radians would be pi, which is 180, divided by 4, since there are 4 45-degree angles in 180. So if we keep going, that means that this is 1 pi over 4. This would be 2 pi over 4, which is also pi over 2. That means if we come over here at 135, we would be at 3 pi over 4. Okay? And then this last one would be 4 pi over 4. We're going to go ahead and keep going past that. So if we have another 45 degrees, this would be 5 pi over 4. Which is just saying if you were to multiply 45 degrees by 5. Keep going another 45 degrees. This one would be 6 pi over 4, which is 3 pi over 2. And 315 would be 7 pi over 4. The last one, 8 pi over 4, which is the same as 2 pi. So these are all of the multiples of 45 degrees on your unit circle in radians. It's going to be important that we're able to switch back and forth between degrees and radians and also know where these would land on your unit circle. So that leaves us with having to do 30 multiples of 30 and 60. Luckily, multiples of 30 will also include the 60, so we're going to go ahead and fill in the rest of our angles. So if you think about 30 degrees, how many 30 degrees go into 180? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 30 degrees in 180. So that means the radians would be pi, which is 180, divided by 6. So for 30 degrees, that is pi over 6. Now, again, think of this as 1 pi over 6. If you go another 30 degrees, that would bring you to 60. You can think of 60 as 2 pi over 6. But what does that simplify to? The 2 and the 6 would cancel, and you are left with pi over 3. Also notice there are 3 60-degree angles in 180. So that's also where this one's coming from. So 2 pi over 6. We're going to go another 30 degrees. That would be 3 pi over 6, which is the same thing as pi over 2. We're going to go another 30 degrees. This one would be 4 pi over 6. And if we simplify that, 4 and 6 will simplify to 2 pi over 3. And then we're going to keep going. Another 30 degrees would bring us to 5 pi over 6. So 150 is 5 pi over 6. And then 180 is 6 pi over 6, which is just pi. Another 30 degrees, we would have 7 pi over 6. Another 30 degrees, we would have 8 pi over 6, which would simplify to 4 pi over 3. This one would be 9 pi over 6, which is 3 pi over 2. Here we would have 10 pi over 6, which would simplify to 5 pi over 3. And here we would have 11 pi over 6. 12 pi over 6 would give us 2 pi. So that is labeling all of the angles on the unit circle. And I know that this is a lot of information, but one thing that you have to be comfortable with is being able to switch back and forth, and also noting that if something has, a denominator of 4, that means that that's going to be a multiple of pi over 4. So the reference angle is going to be 45 degrees. So we're still going to be using reference angles with radians, so it's still important to know pi over 6, pi over 4, and pi over 3, because that will tell you what your reference angle is.